Now, essentially, a nuclear plant, the purpose of it is to boil water.
Yes.
Is this really the best way to boil water?
I would say no, absolutely not. We have so many problems with this. If you look at the life cycle...
But let me just cut in for a second. Let me just also just move on here. I get my point in there about water. Now, let's talk about China for a second. They're building some kind of plant with thorium. I had some notes here that have disappeared, but thorium, I believe, is involved. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that a next generation, or what's going on there?
People talk about it as a next generation. I regard it as even more complex in terms of design than uranium reactors. My basic argument with nuclear in general, whatever technologies people choose to use, well, there's a number of arguments. If you look at the whole life cycle, I would say the energy returned on energy invested is low. It's not anything like what people discuss. So that is the amount of energy that you get back when you subtract off what energy you have to put in to produce the energy in the first place. I would argue that net energy is not very high. When you look at mining and construction and everything through to decommissioning, the costs are horrendously high. They're always underestimated by nuclear proponents. So I think we are not accurately assessing the cost. Typically, we're not really factoring in decommissioning. And this can be tens of billions of dollars. All the revenue stream comes at the beginning when we create the power. The decommissioning can be decades later. There's no revenue stream to provide for it at that time. There may be funds put aside, but as we know in financial crisis, funds can disappear on you at inconvenient times. I think the odds of there being any money whatsoever to decommission these reactors when they need to be decommissioned is very low. And so we're leaving an enormous problem for subsequent generations. And then we're not looking after the fuel, we're not factoring in the costs or the risks of the long-term storage and containment, the potential risks if we don't design that properly. I mean, there are so many problems, and we're designing systems that are intended to last and be maintained at their level of complexity for longer than any human society has yet managed to exist. This is the height of hubris. I think we absolutely need to look at what we're doing here, because I'm not sure the odds are that we're even going to know how to look after any of these things in a few decades' time. I'm expecting a lot of upheaval to come out of the depression that I think we're on the verge of, and I think we could find knowledge being lost. We're not, I think, going to be able to handle the mess we're creating. And nuclear power, because it is so complex, is not compatible with social breakdown. This is what we saw in the Soviet Union. This is one of the things that interested me the most. They were having so much trouble because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were trying to maintain these complex systems in the teeth of collapse. The people who worked at these plants were paid months late, if at all. They turned up for work because they didn't have to necessarily pay rent or utilities. This being the Soviet Union, accommodation was centrally provided. Who's going to turn up to work in a nuclear plant if nobody's paying them in many other parts of the world? And in the Soviet Union, because people weren't being paid, they were often moonlighting, trying to find some other way of earning money. This, of course, meant they were perhaps not concentrating all that much or not getting a lot of sleep. There were people turning up drunk because their lives were so miserable. And you ask yourself, how can you maintain a safety culture under those circumstances? So anything that is of questionable safety under normal circumstances, even if you add a significant geological event like an earthquake, imagine how much less safe that would be under circumstances of acute social upheaval where people are playing a blame game over who's just caused the bubble to burst, and nobody's paying the people who are supposed to be doing this job. We're not training enough young people to go into these fields. So the average age of the people who work in this field is rising all the time. At some point they'll retire if we don't train enough young people. Where does the expertise come from to deal with all these incredibly long-term problems that we're designing for ourselves?
Yeah, who's going to work in a nuke plant except for maybe Homer Simpson? He seems to enjoy his work down there in wherever he lives, Simpsonville. He works for Mr. Burns, the evil
Indeed.
nuke plant owner.
Springfield, I believe it
but
is.
let me just inject something here. Of course, what's really amazing is that the Earth receives 1,000 times more energy than it uses per day from something called the sun. This is something that Buckminster Fuller pointed out 45 years ago. as he tried to wean America and other cultures off fossil fuels with his technological ideas. But of course, he was painted as a heretic by the nuclear industry and the oil industry, et cetera. But let's talk about markets for a second. You talked about the costs involved in these plants, maintaining the plants, decommissioning the plants. The Japanese stock market is not really suffering at the moment. Many are talking about the fact that this is not going to have a huge impact on the GDP of Japan. Is this a good guess on their part, or is somebody missing what the true cost might be here and how that's reflected in the market?
Oh, I think it's a complete fantasy to say that it won't have any effect. I think in the Japanese market, we initially saw the effect of fear, but markets never move only in one direction. When you turn towards a bear market, which I would argue we have done very recently, a resumption of the credit crunch this will lead to, but what you have is a lot of volatility. So you have sharp moves down, very sharp moves up, but I think we are going to be turning the corner and moving into an era where fear is in the ascendancy. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination we've seen the end of what's going to happen at Fukushima. I think we are going to see a lot more fear around that, but also just more general fear in markets, which is characteristic of sharp declines. This is what propagates sharp declines. It's the spread of fear. And we saw the reaction in the markets, not just in Japan, but much more widely. I think we're going to see that resume fairly soon. And so I think the impact in terms of a feedback loop that spreads fear is going to be huge. I think the problem that Japan is facing is quite likely.
But Nicole, the feedback loop you refer to about getting fear into the market seems broken, because these markets are not operating on their own accord. They're being manipulated by central bankers who are injecting massive amounts of fresh credit to keep the good times rolling. So they're giving people a false sense of security and a false sense of what this disaster is all about by using credit injections as a form of propaganda. It's almost as if the central banks are engaged in a new form of 21st century propaganda. By injecting credit, they're saying everything's great, the markets are great. But of course, the volume in these markets is collapsing, and the smart money, the really rich people around the world, have been net sellers of stocks now heavily for 2 years. So how do you get the fear into these prices? Because right now the prices are saying, be happy, no problem, radiation's good for you. There's a massive global radiation cloud which is going to touch every human being, but don't worry. How do you get fear into the market again?
I think fear will return spontaneously. I think the efforts to prop up confidence are extremely limited. They're kicking the can down the road to the extent that they can, but I don't think they have actually anywhere near the power to maintain that they and most other people seem to think they do. They would very much like people to believe they have that power, but I really think that they don't, and that fear is going to make a spontaneous comeback. I mean, markets move.
Okay, so let me get this. So this would then probably give more credence to your overarching belief of deflation going forward, more deflation. This only adds to the deflationary story, I would imagine, Nicole Foss.
Very much so, because when you have the spread of fear and confidence disappears, confidence basically is liquidity. Once the confidence dissipates, and it can do so very quickly, I think we're going to see liquidity dry up drastically. The ability to service debt contracts with it. Fear generates the need for a higher risk premium on debt, so interest rates can go up. Not necessarily on all debt. The most secure debt will probably see interest rates stay low, but I think you get enormous credit spreads, so lower quality debt, the interest rates spike. You can end up getting a wave of debt default. Under those circumstances, that is deflation by definition, because to me, my definition of deflation is the contraction of money plus credit relative to available goods and services. So I think absolutely the spread of fear is going to really cause a very rapid resurgence of deflation. And my concern for Japan is that what has just happened will be their New Orleans moment, their Hurricane Katrina moment, times hundreds. Because the United States never really managed to repair New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, despite the fact that it was one city in a country that had a lot more money at its disposal than Japan probably will in the future. They have a total debt to GDP of 471% the last time I looked, the worst in the world. Where are they going to get the money to rebuild the coast? And it's not just one city, it's many, many. Look at the pictures of the devastation.
Okay, well, Nicole, let me jump in there. The Bank of Japan just announced this past week that they're going to start issuing bonds directly. They're going to bypass the entire finance infrastructure. They're going to offer Bank of Japan bonds collateralized by the ability of the Bank of Japan to increase the fiat money supply. This is unprecedented. Now, is this going to work? I mean, if they think it's going to work, they have great faith in it. The markets seem to think it's going to work. Why wouldn't it work?
Well, I think it's just going to prove to be completely incredible. And basically, they're trying to go for the biggest possible lie, and the bigger the lie, perhaps the more people might believe it. But I think at some point, you simply cannot kick the can down the road. They are already the world's largest debtors. How long are people going to continue to fund those deficits when their ability to grow is going to be sharply curtailed by the damage to their infrastructure? I think we're going to see interest rates rise in Japan. I think we're going to see the carry trade go sharply into reverse, which means the yen will likely appreciate. And all sorts of cascading events, I think, follow from that. I think the impact on Japan's GDP will be huge. And the attempts to control this by central authorities will be completely overwhelmed by events.
All right, we're going to have to cut it off there. Next time you can talk a little bit about how rising interest rates equals deflation, but we don't have time for that today. We'll get back to that next time. But Nicole Foss, thanks so much for being on the edge.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Kaiser. I want to thank my guest, Nicole Foss. And she's over there at the Automatic Earth blog, must reading for anyone who wants to be truly informed about what we just talked about, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.